Hello and welcome to the third week of Film 256, The Underground Cinema. Today I'm going to give you an overview of the history and theories of the avant-garde and the underground animation. Animation has always provided the experimental cinema and the avant-garde artist with explorations of new ideas and possibilities. In animation in general, we have more liberty for abstract treatment because the artists they can just play with lines and colors and they do not have to be figurative. Keep in mind that in films, because of the nature of the film that it reproduces reality, you cannot get out of that relationship with reality, even in movies such as A Man with a Movie Camera that doesn't have any story and it's totally abstract, or films like Ballet Mechanic that is coming of Dadaism. Still, movies have direct relationship with reality. In animation, however, the artist could even just paint abstract figures on films directly. Kind of easier manipulation of time and movement, but at the same time, the body. Now, one thing is that in animation, because it's based on morphology, that's the basis of animation. So we have this extreme treatment of the body and instability of sort of a bodily identity to the degree that we can experience bodily transformation beyond any linguistic conceptualization. The abstract treatment of the subject is becoming easier for the artist. Artists such as Hans Richter, the Cubist artist, they used animation because they figured out that they can just add movement and time, these two dimensions, to their abstract arts. In animation, the audience does not expect certain respects for the laws of physics or the norms of society. Each artist creates her own rules for the imaginative world that she has created. Everything is transformative. Any rules can be broken. And maybe for that reason, it's suitable for surrealism, for example. With regards to the history of animation, it's important to talk about Disney. Maybe you're surprised seeing the fact that I put a slide of Disney in a lecture that is dedicated to the underground practice of making animations. Because usually we know Disney films as very conservative, specifically in terms of their treatment of gender roles in films like such as Snow White. However, actually, in the beginning, Disney Studios were interested in creating avant-garde films in the 20s. Sergei Eisenstein, you can see him in the picture on the right, was a fan of Disney, and like actually he met Walt Disney in 1929 for a couple of times, and so at that time they kept it quiet a little bit because of the fear that he could get into trouble when going back to Russia. But in general, a modernist director like Sergei Eisenstein was fascinated by cartoons, especially with the use of sound. Because he believed that Disney's very formalist approach to sound was very similar to his theories of filmmaking. He was mainly fascinated by the fact that there was no hierarchy of sounds in Disney films, and I'm going to explain what I mean after giving you an example of that approach. In short, a modernist filmmaker with a Marxist background as the dominant ideology where he came from, Sergei Eisenstein was very interested in early Disney films. One reason was the illusion of depth in Disney's films. That was something that the constructivists were very interested. On the other hand, Disney was sure that sound could be used very effectively in his cartoons. As a matter of fact, time, duration, and representation of movement were issues for both the modernist filmmakers, such as Sergei Eisenstein, and also the cartoon industry. So, flatness of Disney cartoons, the depth of illusion, for example, was a main concerns for the Cubist and other modernist approach to art. So Eisenstein wrote actually about Disney, and he believed that the only man in the United States who could use sound properly was Disney, the visual dance in conjunction with sound. Eisenstein was against talkie film and would see them pervasive. He was more interested in silent films as more cinematic. Introduction of sound, they believed that sound would take movies into the direction of realism. It did in actually like the Soviet Union and other European countries, but he believed that actually in the United States, cartoons are not going to the direction of realism. They don't use sound in realistic ways. As he was kind of critical of socialist realist animations of the Soviets, although probably those films for him were ideologically correct but technically weak. Disney cartoons were taking a very formalist approach, according to him. So in this slide, you can see that he's shaking hand with Mickey Mouse. So I'm going to explain further the term Mickey Mousing in this slide. The Mickey Mousing effect is when the diegetic sound is used non-realistically. For example, when the characters, sometimes even in movies, pour a beer and you hear the sound brr. It's just something that mirrors the cartoonish feeling of the act. Another thing is that of nature in Disney films. It becomes um, like because of this transformation that is taking place all the time, the nature is becoming like anti-nature, and then it becomes nature again, and sometimes it becomes something in between. It's always the nature is also something in movement. Again, is not shown in a stable thing. Another reason that an artist like Eisenstein, with a Marxist background, was interested in animation was the fact that power would never remain in one image. Power is always something that is changeable. A fish, for example, that quickly turns into a tiger, a thesis and the antithesis and the creations of synthesis constantly. When one figure is purposeful in one time, it has to change into a different thing to be purposeful. And then, because in that moment of the film, the power is shifted. So it's not one type of figure that is the source of power forever. So that sort of transformation of figures was something interesting, that aspects of morphology. So now I'm going to show one example of early Disney film, Silly Symphonies, a Skeleton Dance, that was made in 1928. Think about how it's synchronized, how it's rhythmic. It's just a visual dance. It's abstract. The topic for that time was a little too much. Like you always think of the fact that cartoons are directed for kids, the audience of cartoon. And for that reason, sometimes they are more political because they're not under the radar, because nobody take them, or it's the idea that the government or people in charge of censorship wouldn't take them seriously. They don't think that they can be effective medium for political revolutions. So when watching this clip, please pay attention to the Mickey Mousing effect. What I mean when I say that Disney films understand no differences between the types of sounds. All sounds, diegetic or non-diegetics, are part of the music. One is not more important. Diegetic is the sound that is coming from the word of the film. If someone is playing the piano and the other characters are hearing the playing of piano, anything that is coming from the word of the film. But the soundtracks are non-diegetics because we know that, for example, at the end of Titanic, Celine Dion is not there, and the characters are not listening to her song. That's an editorial addition. Usually, the symphonic music that accompanies the soundtracks. Usually, they we call them non-diegetic sounds because they were added, and the characters wouldn't hear that. They just dramatize the thing. Very interesting in what you're going to watch. Pay attention to the sound. The sort of combination of non-diegetic and diegetic, they sort of support each other. It seems that the diegetic sounds that are coming were all composed. They were written by the composer, and it's part of the non-diegetic music, those diegetic sounds, and that's why I say that it seems that there's no uh, a difference in the way that the movie treats them. It's not one more realistic, usually the diegetic, and the other one is just an editorial addition. Both, are somehow both diegetic and non-diegetic sounds are composed carefully for this visual dance. So this is an example of early Disney films. I say they were more experimenting with avant-garde themes in the beginning, and then they became a standard of sort of Hollywood animation, specifically very conventional in the treatment of gender role. But so the influence of these Disney films in on European modernist animator is something that should be known. That the generation of post-war artists in Eastern Europe, specifically like Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary, that they were looking at these early Disney works. So now that I talked about Walt Disney, I'm going to fast forward and show something that is maybe anti-Disney. So in 2014 in Ottawa Animation Festival, I saw a Polish film called Hippopotami, and it was a movie that reversed what usually is done in mainstream animation, specifically Disney's, and that the idea of anthropomorphizing animal figures. So usually in cartoons, especially for those directed for kids, the animal figures were acting like humans. They were anthropomorphized. However, in the movie that you're going to see parts of it now, Hippopotami, the human figures are acting like hippos. And so they're in this half shore and living in the river. They're giving birth to their kids under the river. So they act like just hippos, but they're just human figure. So it's doing it's sort of subverting what is usually being done in animation. So before giving you a couple of examples, I just wanted to talk about these theories because about animation and how an animation can be a perfect medium for abstract art or other sort of underground forms are vast. And so the one issue is the idea of modernity thesis. Because one might say, like the whole idea of modernity thesis, remember last week with cinema with like someone like Jigo Vertov or Ballet Mechanique. The whole idea is that if our perception may be transformed by modernity, specifically with cinema. Remember that last scene, the man with a movie camera, that we can see the city from different angles, and then we can look. Even our perception is going to be improved by the kino eye. Okay? That if we add that sort of mechanical perceptions of the machine. Can animator provide ideas and notion that film cannot? Can they go further and transform our perspectives about the world, even in a more radical ways? I think the answer is yes. Now let's talk about these things further by examinations of a few examples. The first example that I chose to talk about is Quay brothers, twin brothers, American artists. So in Quay Brothers animation, inanimate objects come to life to create an uncanny universe in that sort of dark tone, and though that with still a combination of music. One thing that is very, I think, important in studying animation is that sound is very important. It's as important as the image. That maybe usually people think of a sound in movies as just secondary. It's something that is dramatized the action furthermore, but it's not something that is studied as the most important artistic dimension of films. Maybe, but you cannot really reject the fact that, for instance, in the scene that you are going to watch, that the sort of uncanny universe, that the source of uncertainty, horror, and anxiety that the movie creates, um, to a great deal, is created by the sound. Very kind of airy, the whole thing, both the visual elements of the scene and the sound. The next figure that I want to talk is Jiri Barta, and one of many Czechoslovakian animators in the 60s, 70s, and even the 80s. Eastern European animations were very progressive. So he made several animation with a focus on wood carving. But one thing is that he reimagines the world of children's fairy tale into something creepy, something unstable, something that again gives you some sort of anxiety. And there's a whole political aspect to it. So they were interpreted as a criticism of the socialist state in Czechoslovakia, the dehumanizations of the workers, the seriousness of the world in the socialist states. A society that is not built on compassion. My next example is an American artist called Jordan Belsom. He's taking more abstract and he's playing with just lines actually. So Jordan Belsom is also like those early modern works is focusing on simple shapes, lines, and dots. Um, but in contrast to those like Dadaist works, for example, he's trying to create a more spiritual, religious perspectives for the audience. Unlike Canadian movies that are not very well known outside Canada in the international market, Canada is well known for its animation industry, specifically because of NFB. NFB has an important role for providing funds for young and amateur artists for decades. So if you go to NFB websites, you can see a huge collections of experimental animations. So the NFB support has provided opportunities for different communities. So unlike United States, where like the film industry is located at certain places like Hollywood in California, indie films in New York City or New Orleans, in Canada, a number of artists are coming from Winnipeg, Ottawa, Toronto, Montreal, Sudbury, and also from different communities, such as different racial backgrounds. It provided opportunities for indigenous women artists, for example, because we're going to watch one of them in our session on indigenous studies called Bida Ban. So that futuristic indigenous perspective by an artist like Lisa Jackson is something that is very unique to Canada, and it's just because of that sort of democratic opportunities for amateur artists. Although actually Lisa Jackson didn't get the fund from NFB, so for decades, Canadian animations were being internationally recognized. They were nominated for Oscars. One of them, for example, in 2004, called Ryan by Chris Landreth, won the Academy Award for that year. So Canada has been remained a pioneer and a leader in computer animation as well. So the Ottawa International Animation Festival is another thing. It's the largest animation festival in North America. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about cyberpunk Japanese anime, very different from American tradition of making animation. Usually, the Japanese culture is known as a very homogeneous culture, and this is these Japanese anime, the post-apocalyptic films. They're going against that assumption. You see juvenile delinquencies, transformations of identities, even gender identities. People are kind of in the different bodies, and you can see the bikers, neon signs, all those things that combine low life with high tech.
An important theme of cyberpunk, and specifically Japanese anime cyberpunks, is the idea of metamorphosis. Science fiction, and specifically animation, provides the space for the expressions of youth in search of identity in some sort of a post-apocalyptic setting. But the more it's always in a personal level, although that sort of apocalyptic situation is always related with some sort of national trauma, as I said, namely the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. However, it's about how each individual, each person is affected, also in the level of the body itself. So these films, like the films of David Cronenberg's, and I'm going to explain that in the next slides further, they are in the traditions of body horror. Usually you see sort of characters who cross gender boundaries in some sort of grotesque way, or grotesque sort of idea of birth and rebirth. Initially, you see it's focusing on this sort of metamorphic potential of the body. However, all these films ultimately end up privileging the absence of the body. So each film, like Ghost in the Shell and Akira, ends with this protagonist potentially giving up his or her corporeal self. So the body is very important, but unlike Cronenberg films, at the end, the non-corporeal state of being is suggested. You see in these pictures the apocalyptic effects in cyberpunk animes, reminiscence of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is an ongoing theme in Japanese science fictions. After the Second World War, direct criticisms of American troops were not permitted. So a number of Japanese filmmakers used science fiction to pass that sort of limitations and censorship. So Godzilla was about or it's created, that monster, that unknown monster was created by atomic blasts. And you see the similar theme is repeated in films like Akira, Ghost in the Shell, and other Japanese science fiction and animes. So you are going to see these images that I put on these slides that were showing the post-nuclear apocalypse. So anime is a cultural phenomenon, both sociologically and aesthetically. It's a culture by which in Japan, it belongs to the mass culture, the popular culture. And in North America, it exists as a subculture. It, like in the previous slide and the slide, the second slide here, you see how it becomes some sort of a commentary about the horror of a nuclear war as a national trauma. But again, how individual character is also related to something that is experienced collectively. So what is an individual identity? The sort of punk movement in Japan is trying to say how one individual is related, how we have the sort of acceptance of other identities. And in terms of its aesthetic quality, it's interesting that animes are very different than Disney's. Usually they're not much animated, and it's because of some sort of economical limitations. In Disney, it takes time, labor, and money, and in Disney, they were getting close to that sort of 24 frames per second. They never reached that. But in Japan, because they wanted like 40% of actually television products were animation. So the solution was to do less animation, solid background. Sometimes the lips movement, it's not a very realistic sort of lips movement. So it's just characters are closing and opening the mouth. Or like the idea that the background is kind of staying, there's no movement, just a blink of an eye by one character. So although it started as some sort of a limitation, it became something cultural. Now a film like Akira is a high budget, and after the transition to digital with the CGI, we don't have that much some sort of limitations in terms of animation, but you're going to see that this is the quality of anime. is how it's different from Disney. So they all have that sort of quality that historically is something, is a phenomenon because of the industrial and economical limitations that they have.
So for your discussion post this week, you can again write on one or all the examples. I added a couple of more shorts in the UR courses, so there may be more topics than what's been indicated in the syllabus.